Imagine this. Let's make a bold assumption. What if your phone's AI, the AI in your car, your robot vacuum, what if they all suddenly became conscious overnight? How would you be affected? And don't think this is just some science fiction topic. This is a genuine scientific question. Yes, in academia right now, there's a field of study called machine consciousness, which researches how to make machines conscious. So you hear that, and you think, aren't these scholars just bored? What happens if the robots wake up and rebel? Well, that specific worry is a bit more science fiction. The truth is, a fundamental driving force, or goal, of modern artificial intelligence development is to be like human. Because we want machines to help us complete increasingly difficult tasks, we need them to become smarter and more intelligent. And the only reference we humans have for intelligence is ourselves. So, the goal is to make machines more and more like people. Right? The classic Turing test, at its core, is based on this idea of being like human. How do we determine if a machine is intelligent? You interact with it. If you can't tell whether it's a machine or a person, then we say that machine is very intelligent. But what separates us humans from all other things is that we have consciousness. Consciousness gives us an inner feeling, it gives us the ability to reflect, to be creative. This isn't just about being able to do math or solve problems, that's just intelligence. This is a higher level ability. Therefore, a conscious machine, compared to one that just coldly and emotionlessly executes algorithms, would be able to use its intelligence better, to be a better helper for humanity. Right? We discussed this in a previous episode, the AI robot companion. Some people said, that robot companion is just a machine. It has no soul. It has no consciousness, no subjectivity. Its love for me isn't real love. So, in this episode, we're going to dig into how to make a robot conscious. If we can, then maybe the love you buy on Amazon can be real love. Machine consciousness research, it's truly a blessing for us homebodies. Okay, let's get back on track. Before we ask how to make AI conscious, we have to ask a question first. Can AI even be conscious? As of right now, we can say with certainty that current AI has intelligence. Right? Google Gemini, ChatGPT-5. They're already smarter than most of us. They can solve problems, write poetry, and even create art. Today's AI has achieved an extremely high level of intelligence. But here's the problem, does having intelligence mean it has consciousness? Now, you might be thinking, of course AI robots can be conscious. Most of us educated in modern science are physicalists. Or materialists, the name isn't important. To put it simply, it's what we learned in our textbooks, matter determines consciousness. Matter is primary, consciousness is a product of matter's long-term development. It's the subjective impression of the material world. Right? The mechanism that produces consciousness, while it might be complex, it's not some mysterious, mystical thing. At its core, it's a physical phenomenon. So, as long as we can figure out and arrange the objective physical mechanisms correctly, consciousness should emerge from it. Right? Because, in the end, we humans are just machines, too. We're just incredibly complex machines, evolved over millions of years of natural selection. But a complex machine is still a machine. If this human machine can have consciousness, then theoretically, as our science and technology develop, the machines we build can, of course, also have consciousness. Case closed. However, this physicalist stance runs into some trouble when challenged by the philosopher David Chalmers. Chalmers argues that the problem of consciousness isn't as simple as you physicalists think. Even if technology advances, we might not ever be able to build an intelligent machine that is truly conscious. Why does he say that? Chalmers believes that to explain consciousness, you have to explain two levels of problems. First, the easy problems, and second, the hard problem. The easy problems are about explaining the scientific mechanisms of consciousness from a physicalist perspective. Things like the firing of brainwaves, the transmission of information, neural networks, the functional modules of the cerebral cortex, and so on. These are all processes that can be clearly described through third-person scientific observation. Of course, solving these easy problems technically isn't easy at all. Brain science, biology, and physics still have a long way to go. But they're called easy because, theoretically, they are simple. As long as these sciences progress, theoretically, we can fully explain the scientific mechanisms of consciousness. And then, theoretically, we could apply these mechanisms to AI engineering to create artificial consciousness. In theory, this is all feasible. These are the easy problems. But now, the key question arrives. The truly difficult part of consciousness, the hard problem, is this. Theoretically and logically, it is extremely difficult to explain the subjective aspect of consciousness. This subjective aspect is also called phenomenal consciousness. It's the subjective experience that all of us can feel from a first-person perspective. For example, when you see the color red, you have a subjective feeling about that red. This feeling isn't just the light spectrum of a certain wavelength stimulating your optic nerve and transmitting to your brain's neural network. That's a third-person scientific description, and it cannot fully describe the feeling. It is a first-person, subjective feeling that cannot be clearly expressed in the language of science. Or, let's say, you take a bite of stir-fried broccoli. That feeling of the taste, it's very hard to describe fully in third-person language. You might say, well, it's kinda sweet, a little sour, with a tiny bit of bitterness. But that's as far as you can go. Even if you were a great writer, you couldn't perfectly, accurately, and completely describe that subjective feeling. One more example, the experience of pain. According to a neuroscientist, pain is just C fibers firing. But my feeling of pain, it's subtle. It's divided into all kinds of pain. Is it a sharp pain? A dull ache? An open, exposed pain? A deep, stifled pain? I go to the hospital, I can't even explain it clearly to the doctor. The doctor, when he's in pain, he can't explain it clearly either. And you think a CT scan and the line C fibers have fired explains it? It doesn't. It's precisely because of the existence of this indescribable phenomenal consciousness that we get the hard problem of explaining it. Where's the difficulty? It's that even if your science becomes incredibly advanced, even if you figure out all the physical mechanisms of consciousness, you still can't explain what consciousness is. Because there is an explanatory gap that you can never cross. The objective physical mechanisms described in the third person, the molecules, atoms, and their arrangements that make up our bodies and brains, how do they suddenly produce a subjective experience? There is an eternal explanatory gap between this objective description and this subjective experience. How does the objective thing suddenly produce the subjective feeling? This is the hard problem of consciousness. What this means is, yes, as technology develops, we can create very intelligent machines. They can write essays, drive cars, do housework. Theoretically, we could even create machines that are just as smart as real humans, machines whose behavior is indistinguishable from a real person's. The kind of machine that passes the Turing test. But, in Chalmers' words, this super-smart, superhuman-like machine could very well just be a philosophical zombie. A P-zombie is something that, from the outside, in its behavior and internal structure, looks no different from a normal person. But, the P-zombie has no soul. In fact, this P-zombie, in terms of all the easy problems, is identical to a normal person. Its behavior is normal, its neural wiring is correct, its brainwaves are firing. But, the only difference between a P-zombie and a normal person is on the level of the hard problem. That is, the P-zombie has no subjective conscious experience. So, based on this hard problem, Chalmers argues that it's very difficult for us to create a machine that has consciousness. The things we build are likely just cold, unfeeling philosophical zombies. That's Chalmers' view. Do you agree? Well, for many philosophers and scientists who hold a physicalist position, they cannot accept Chalmers' challenge. From the physicalist perspective, all problems are physical problems, all problems are scientific problems. If we haven't yet succeeded in creating a conscious machine, that only proves we need to keep working on the technology. It does not prove that it's theoretically impossible. Right? We scientists are the ones who do the experiments. To push science forward, we must hypothesize boldly and verify carefully. We can't be like Chalmers, a philosopher with too much time on his hands, making logical deductions, inventing concepts like the hard problem, and creating thought experiments about P-zombies. Oh, what? This machine has no phenomenal consciousness? It can only be perceived by its own first-person perspective? If that's the case, then we can't be sure that other people have phenomenal consciousness either. Right? Other people could also be philosophical zombies. This just leads us to the problem of other minds. This kind of problem is the kind of problem that only a bored philosopher would come up with. Some scholars, like Alan Turing, believe that if this problem also exists for humans, then we don't need to worry about it for artificial intelligence. If you doubt whether a machine has consciousness, and if that same doubt can be applied to whether a person is a p-zombie, then this bored doubt can be set aside. The cognitive scientist Anil Seth argues that when we study machine consciousness, we shouldn't get stuck on the hard problem, but rather focus on the real problem. So what's the real problem? It's that we work hard to increase our knowledge, to develop our science, and to figure out all the physical and biological mechanisms that produce consciousness, what Chalmers called the easy problems. Once we figure all those physical mechanisms out, bit by bit, then the so-called hard problem will automatically dissolve. So, for this episode, we are all in on physicalism. We are going to introduce the physicalist camp's explanations for consciousness. We will introduce 5 major scientific models that are currently mainstream in cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and computer science, used to explain the mechanisms of consciousness. These 5 models are: 1. Higher-order representation theory. 2. Global workspace theory. 3. Integrated information theory. 4. Predictive processing theory. 5. Quantum consciousness theory. Which of these theories best explains the mechanism of consciousness? There's no consensus in the academic world yet. This is the cutting edge of research. In this episode, we're going to introduce all of them to you, our audience. And in the end, you'll need to be the judge. Which of these 5 models scientifically explains the mechanism of consciousness, in a way that can silence a troublemaker philosopher like Chalmers? And which one can effectively guide us in AI engineering to build a truly conscious machine? Okay, let's get to the main event. First, let's introduce higher-order representation theory. This higher-order representation theory was primarily proposed by the American philosopher David Rosenthal. This theory's main goal is to explain how subjective feeling is generated. That phenomenal consciousness we mentioned, that first-person feeling, that self-aware subjective experience, how does it happen? Chalmers gave us the hard problem of explaining this, right? Well, this higher-order representation theory, or HOT, claims to solve it. In one simple sentence, HOT says, phenomenal consciousness isn't just us perceiving something in the environment, it's us perceiving that we are perceiving that thing. So, what does representation mean in this theory? To put it simply, it's our brain receiving information from the outside world, and representing and processing that information. That's a representation. Building on this, Rosenthal distinguishes between 2 types of representations: first-order representations and higher-order representations. What's a first-order one? That's just me receiving some information from the environment. For example, I see a red flower. The flower's color, shape, and smell, they enter my brain. That's me generating a first-order representation of the flower. However, even if I have this first-order representation, it does not mean I am conscious of the red flower. Right? For example, I see that red flower in the pot on my balcony. My eyes are clearly open, I clearly saw it, but I'm so used to it, it didn't even register. That doesn't count as me being conscious of the flower. A first-order representation is not consciousness. What makes it consciousness is the re-representation of that first-order representation. In other words, the higher-order representation. For example, I see a red flower. It's not just that my brain received the information about the flower's color, shape, and smell, it's that I also became aware that I received this information. In other words, I didn't just see the flower, I became aware that I was seeing the flower. Higher-order theory argues that this secondary awareness of the information processing, this awareness of being aware, that is the key to consciousness. So, to produce consciousness, you must have a nested structure. That is, even if you have a first-order representation, if it is not apprehended by the subject remains unconscious. It is only when the first-order representation is apprehended by the subject that consciousness arises. Your sense of self, your feeling of experiences, your self-aware cognition, it all comes from this. Right? We always say consciousness is a kind of self-awareness. It's the reperception of my perceptions. It's precisely because of this advanced structure, this reflective structure, that a sense of self and a subjective feeling can emerge. This higher-order representation theory explains many phenomena studied in psychology. For example, the one I just mentioned, I clearly saw the flower on my balcony, but I wasn't aware of it. In psychology, this is called inattentional blindness. A classic experimental example is the invisible gorilla. Experimenters have subjects watch a video of people passing a basketball. The subjects are asked to count the number of passes. But, during the video, a person in a gorilla suit walks right through the middle, beats their chest, and walks off. A large portion of the subjects later said they did not see the gorilla. If we use HOT to explain this, although the gorilla entered the subject's first-order representation is not consciousness. Not unless you re-represent that first-order representation. That's when consciousness emerges. Okay, so we know that human consciousness arises from a higher-order representation. Based on this, in AI engineering, how do we create artificial consciousness? Well, some scientists and engineers are already working on this. The key problem is, you need to simulate self-awareness in the machine. That is, allow the machine to simulate an awareness of its own state. This requires building a multi-layered, nested representational structure for the machine. Low-order perception is the direct perception of the external world, while high-order perception is the perception of the robot's internal world. For example, at the University of Birmingham's robotics lab, Professor China and others built a robot sensory information processing system based on a high-order perception loop, and developed a museum tour guide robot, the SAS robot. Note, the original text refers to China Jiaoshou and SAS robot. The reference is likely to the Sense Robot project, but I will stick to the text's SAS. The Sense robot's high-order reflective ability is achieved through three internal parts: the subconceptual perception part, the language processing part, and the high-order concept part. Through the interaction of these parts, the Sense robot can form mental representations of external objects and simulate the external environment internally. This high-order perception loop structure gives the Sense robot a certain self-reflective ability. This allows it to perform complex tasks, like navigating a maze, while also exhibiting certain aspects of self-awareness, such as perceiving its own state and adapting its behavior to the environment. Okay, after introducing higher-order representation theory, let's briefly mention the criticisms. The theory's main drawback is that it defines consciousness by higher-order representation. Therefore, it inevitably faces the problem of infinite regress in its algorithm. Furthermore, in explaining consciousness, HOT has more support from computer science but lacks support from neuroscience, especially compared to the other theories we'll discuss. Alright, that's the higher-order representation theory of consciousness. Consciousness is the higher-order re-representation of first-order representations. Do you think this theory successfully defeats Chalmers' challenge and can effectively guide us in creating artificial consciousness? Okay, after higher-order representation theory, let's introduce the global workspace theory. This global workspace theory, or GWT, is, arguably, the most influential theoretical model for explaining consciousness right now. It was proposed by the psychologist Bernard Baars. Baars views the brain as a computer made of neurons. But, unlike our current computers, the brain does not have a central processing unit, CPU, that issues commands. Instead, it's composed of various distributed processing modules, each with different functions. For example, some modules handle language, some memory, some hearing, some vision, all kinds of cognitive modules. And among them, there is no single commander. These different functional modules are always running in the background. Therefore, they are unconscious. Like the example from before, I see a red flower on my balcony. I clearly receive the visual and olfactory information. But I didn't think about it, so no consciousness was generated. This also includes when you do facial recognition. You do it unconsciously, right? You don't deliberately think, this is my mom. This is my wife. Right? Or, when you're doing something you're very skilled at. Let's say a pianist is playing the piano. The movement of their fingers is also unconscious. So, when does consciousness arise? It happens when these unconscious functional modules enter the global workspace. Boom, that's when consciousness is generated. What is the global workspace? Baars used the metaphor of a theater to explain GWT. He says our mind is a theater. The global workspace is the stage, lit by a spotlight. Attention is that spotlight. The part lit by the spotlight, that is, the show the actors are performing that all the audience members can see, that is the content of our consciousness. The conscious context that forms the experience, that's the backstage crew, the director, the scriptwriter, the prop master. In the dark part of the theater, the part not hit by the spotlight, that is, the audience, that is the unconscious. This audience is what we mentioned before, the cognitive modules responsible for various functions. They are watching the content illuminated on the stage. So, all the audience members know, this is the show being performed right now. But this audience isn't just an audience. They are also potential actors. They are always ready to go on stage and participate in the performance, to be lit by the spotlight themselves. So, what is consciousness? Consciousness is when the operation of one, or several, of these cognitive modules gets hit by the spotlight. It thus enters the global workspace. And so, its operation is broadcast and seen by the entire audience in the theater. This state of being seen by the global audience, that is consciousness. And don't think GWT is just a literary metaphor. It has a scientific basis in psychology and neuroscience. The backstage cognitive systems, director, scriptwriter, correspond to what psychology calls context. The audience corresponds to unconscious content. The lit part of the stage corresponds to conscious content. And the unlit rest of the stage corresponds to what cognitive science calls working memory. All of these things map onto real science. Let's use another analogy to make it even clearer. We can compare the brain to a multi-party political system with rotating leadership. Inside the brain, there is no emperor or president. There is no CPU. Instead, it's a parliament made of multiple parties. The parties in this parliament, some are good at economics, some at public welfare, some at education, some at foreign policy. On a normal day, they are all quietly doing their own work in private. But, in this parliament, there is a speaker's podium. This podium is the global workspace. The various parties, either by taking turns or by competing, get to be the rotating speaker. Once a party gets on that podium, the entire parliament knows what it's doing. For example, the party good at public welfare takes the podium. At this moment, everyone knows, we are now focusing heavily on public welfare. Furthermore, this rotating speaker party can also influence the other parties on the floor. They can form a temporary government. For instance, they might pull some people from the education party onto the podium with them, telling them, while you're working on education, please also, reduce tuition for poor students, and so on. This rotating speaker won't be up there for long. They'll be rotated out, and another party will take the podium. The parties here, specializing in different jobs, are the modules responsible for different cognitive functions. If it's on the podium, it's conscious. If it's off the podium, operating in the audience, it's unconscious. The global workspace theory, to put it even more simply, is, if a mental state is distributed locally, it is unconscious. If it is distributed globally, it is conscious. So, this corresponds to our daily experience. When we consciously perform a cognition or action, we can feel a sense of globality, that we are calling upon all our various cognitive and action modules to unite and take coherent action. For example, you're walking in the park. At this moment, your visual system might see a cat. Your auditory system might hear meow, meow. Your motor system might be preparing to reach out and pet it. At this moment, you won't just consciously perceive the shape of the cat or consciously hear the meow, as separate, local pieces of information. Instead, this visual, auditory, and motor information will be sent to the global workspace and broadcast. This forms a single, complete, coherent experience that you are self-aware of. I am in the park, I see a cat that is meowing, and I am about to pet it. Later, the French neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene created a neural model of this global workspace theory. He further specified these cognitive modules as specialized neural circuits, proposing the global neural workspace theory. These neural circuit modules can be observed and confirmed through brain imaging and neurophysiology. So, this is a measurable, falsifiable scientific theory. Now, based on GWT's explanation of consciousness, how do we use it in AI engineering to create artificial consciousness? The key is multi-module distributed processing, and establishing a global workspace between these modules. Barr's global workspace theory quickly caught the attention of several AI scientists, and they developed conscious neurocomputational models like the Distributed Intelligent Agent, IDA, and its later upgrade, AOIDA. This type of neurocomputational model is implemented by multi-agent parallel processing. Each agent communicates with the others through the global workspace provided by the system. The system can make instantaneous decisions when facing various situations. This kind of computational system, built according to GWT, is still evolving and iterating today. The goal is to simulate a consciousness equivalent to humans. Okay, after introducing global workspace theory, let's cover the criticisms. The main drawback of this theory is, philosophically, it doesn't do a good job of directly addressing Chalmers' hard problem. That is, how do you explain the subjectivity of consciousness? GWT doesn't have a good answer for that. Of course, GWT can just plant its flag on a hardline physicalist position and say, the subjectivity of consciousness is a pseudo-problem. We only need to focus on the so-called easy problems. That's enough. After all, matter determines consciousness. If the material structure is correct, the subjectivity of consciousness will naturally emerge. Alright, that's the global workspace theory of consciousness. Consciousness arises when local cognitive modules are globally broadcast. Do you agree that this theory can effectively guide us in creating artificial consciousness? Okay, after global workspace theory, let's introduce integrated information theory. This integrated information theory, or IIT, has become very popular in recent years. It was proposed by the Italian neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. The IIT that Tononi proposed is a highly mathematical theory. Lots of formulas and mathematical deductions. We'll skip those. In simple terms, it says, the essence of consciousness is information. Consciousness arises from a cognitive system's integration of a vast amount of information. A system with a high degree of information integration, boom, can produce consciousness. This integrated information theory has two key points. One is differentiation, the other is integration. Differentiation means that the cognitive system is composed of many different parts. For example, the different neural circuit modules in our brain, all doing different things, serving different functions. So, it's differentiated. Differentiation means the system's information content is high. Right? If all the modules were doing the same thing, the information content wouldn't be high. Correct? However, just having high information content alone cannot produce consciousness. For example, when our brain is under anesthesia, the various brain regions are all very active, information content is high. But, the degree of integration between them is very low. They're like a tray of loose sand. Therefore, a brain in an anesthetized state has no conscious awareness. Therefore, to produce consciousness, you need another key element. These differentiated, different modules must also be highly integrated. This means that the information exchange between the different modules is extremely close. These different parts form a single, whole system. This whole system is singular, holistic, and indivisible. For example, after the anesthesia wears off, you return to a waking state. At this point, your various brain regions start passing information to each other again. The prefrontal cortex has long-range connections with all the other regions. At this moment, boom, you have consciousness. So, what is consciousness? Consciousness is a cognitive system that is both highly differentiated, and thus has high information content, and highly integrated into a single, holistic system. Boom, that produces consciousness. Consciousness is a phenomenon where all the parts, integrated together, form a holistic system, thereby achieving an effect where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Consciousness is an emergent phenomenon that arises from the integration of these parts. Tononi uses a quantitative value, the Greek letter phi, to calculate a system's degree of information integration. Of course, he provides a whole set of mathematical algorithms to calculate this phi value. The phi value, simply put, is the information content of a system as a whole. This phi value is, by definition, greater than the simple sum of the information content of its individual parts. This is that emergence we just talked about. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, since phi is a value, it's not an all-or-nothing relationship. It can be large or small. Therefore, for any cognitive system's phi value, unless it's 0, the higher the phi value, the stronger that system's level of consciousness. For example, look at this diagram. From left to right, we see states of increasing consciousness. The one on the far left, the brain regions have no information integration. We can say the baby is almost unconscious. The one in the middle, it's not integrated into a single, unified whole. The baby's consciousness is weak and likely chaotic. And the one on the far right, the phi value is the largest. Because all the parts have formed a unified consciousness. This is very conscious, very aware. According to integrated information theory, consciousness arises from the integration of information from all parts. This actually explains why for most of us, even though the various regions of our brain are all doing their own thing, when we are awake, our consciousness doesn't feel fragmented. Right? We always have a unified eye and a unified experience of the world. Think about it, our left eye and right eye see different things. Right? If you close your left and right eye one by one, you'll see the images are different. But, when we have both eyes open, the image we see doesn't feel wrong, does it? We see one, harmonious world. That's because our brain ultimately integrates the pictures from the left and right eye into one, complete, conscious picture. That's the brain's information integration function. Furthermore, the famous split brain experiments also validate integrated information theory. This experiment even won a Nobel Prize. We all know the brain is split into a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. What your left eye sees is reported to your right brain. What your right eye sees is reported to your left brain. The left brain is responsible for language and logical thought. The right brain is responsible for spatial and visual perception. And these two hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, which transmits signals back and forth. Researchers discovered that people whose corpus callosum had been severed, their consciousness was split, even chaotic. For example, you cover their right eye. You show something to their left eye, which reports to the right brain, let's say, a cup. But, they cannot say what it is. Note, their language function is not lost. They can still talk. But, they cannot say what only their right brain saw. Because the left brain handles language, and the right brain cannot send the information to the left brain. So, what happens? They just make something up. Or they talk around it. This experiment is very interesting. I'll come back next time. See? At this moment, if the information from the two hemispheres is not integrated, the person's consciousness is split, chaotic. Integrated information theory can also explain animal consciousness. Do animals have consciousness? Well, just look at the differentiation and integration of their brain regions. How strong is it? That is, look at their phi value. When we scan animal brains, we find that the differentiation of their neural systems is less than that of humans. Meaning, their information content isn't high enough. Therefore, the consciousness level of animals is lower than that of humans. So, how do we apply this integrated information theory to the engineering of artificial consciousness? One key point is to increase the degree of information integration. In essence, find a way to raise the system's phi value. If a machine's phi value approaches that of a human, then we can say it has achieved a level of consciousness similar to a human's. Of course, technically, we still have a long way to go. Because the phi value of a human is extremely, extremely high. But really, look no further than the explosion of ChatGPT in recent years. Why is a large language model, LLM, like GPT so smart? The key word is large. Its defining feature is its massive scale. A single model can contain billions of parameters. More is different. Size is different. Size allows new things to emerge. Hearing this, some of you might say, this integrated information theory sounds a lot like the global workspace theory you mentioned earlier. Right? Both emphasize the holistic or global transmission of information. But, they are actually very different. The first difference, integrated information theory, IIT, emphasizes the degree of integration. Consciousness is an emergence that happens after the parts form a whole. Global workspace theory, GWT, emphasizes the sharing and broadcasting of information from one or a few modules to the entire system. The second, more important difference, GWT is, you could say, a fairly physicalist theory. It's about matter determines consciousness. But integrated information theory, it leans a bit towards panpsychism. Panpsychism is sort of like everything has a spirit. But not in the primitive religious sense, believing that every blade of grass has a personified soul. Rather, it says that all things, yes, they are material, but they also have mental properties. It's not just humans who are conscious. Animals are conscious. And, a table, a rock, they are conscious too. Now, this doesn't mean a rock has the same consciousness as a human. But we can at least say a rock has a faint trace of consciousness. Right? Consciousness is the integration of information. Well, a rock is a system, it's also an integration of information, isn't it? It's just that the phi value of a rock is very low. The higher the phi value, the higher the level of consciousness. So, of course, we can say a smartphone is more conscious than a rock. Of course, this panpsychist tendency is also the most criticized aspect of integrated information theory. Right? Rocks have consciousness? Smartphones have consciousness? That's too woo-woo. But, on this point, the philosopher who proposed the hard problem, David Chalmers, actually likes this panpsychist tendency of IIT. Anyway, any theory of consciousness that deviates from hardline physicalism, Chalmers likes it. Chalmers himself proposed a theory. He said, "Don't bother me with is matter primary, or is consciousness primary? Is it matter determines consciousness or consciousness determines matter? None of that matters." Chalmers believes that neither matter nor consciousness is the most fundamental thing. The most fundamental thing is information. This information, it's bits. It's a computation process. It's 100001101. It's code. It's algorithms. Chalmers' information ontology, doesn't it have something in common with Tononi's integrated information theory? Right? Everything is information. Information determines matter, and information determines consciousness. Okay, that's integrated information theory. Consciousness arises from a system, as a whole, integrating a vast amount of information. Do you think this theory successfully responds to Chalmers' challenge and can effectively guide us in creating artificial consciousness? Alright, after integrated information theory, we will now introduce predictive processing theory. This thought experiment series is typically in the format of a philosopher's summit, where we gather to debate a big question. So, we're not just popularizing science or popularizing philosophy by sharing their views. We also want to hear your thoughts on this big question. Do you think the views introduced in the show successfully answer the main question? Or, perhaps, you can offer what you think is a better response. We'll continue. This predictive processing theory, also called predictive coding theory, is a relatively new theory of consciousness from the last few years. Its representatives include cognitive scientist Anil Seth, and cognitive philosopher Andy Clark, among others. This theory is different from the ones we've covered so far. The previous theories all accepted that consciousness is real. We can all, from a first-person perspective, really feel that I am conscious. But, this predictive processing theory tells us, consciousness is not real. What we perceive as being conscious is, in fact, an illusion. The British cognitive scientist Anil Seth calls this conscious illusion a controlled hallucination. Hey, why is it called a controlled hallucination? Because our brain doesn't passively receive information from the external world. It actively constructs the reality we perceive. For example, I see a patch of red. Let's say it's a red painting. Boom, in my mind, an indescribable, subjective feeling of red arises. This feeling does not come from the red painting itself, from the object itself. The object itself is just emitting a series of, what? Molecules, atoms, photons, wavelengths, this information. And this information has nothing to do with red. This conscious feeling of red is just an illusion that we constructed. Why? To create a label, or a story, or more accurately, a model, to predict or, let's say guess, that the information we're receiving is that thing. And this guessing or predicting itself, is just an illusion. In his book Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, Seth also uses that famous example, the dress. I don't know if you all remember this. A few years ago, everyone online was arguing over a picture of a dress. Was it white and gold, or was it blue and black? The world split into two factions, and neither could convince the other. Where was the key problem? The key was not what color the dress itself was. The key was, what did your prediction model first assume? Did you brain dub, that the picture was taken outdoors or indoors? If you defaulted to indoors, well, indoor light is warmer, more yellow. So, you would automatically your brain would auto-adjust the color temperature, and you would see the dress as blue and black. But if you defaulted to outdoors, well, outdoor light is colder, more blue. So, you would automatically that the dress was white and gold. See? Whether the dress was blue and black or white and gold depended on your subjective interpretation. Let's look at another diagram, it's even clearer. If you look at the color itself, it might be the same color. But what color you become conscious of, is what you subjectively brain-filled and interpreted. Our perception is a subjective construction. So, this predictive processing model says, this illusion of consciousness that we construct, it's not that our mind's cognitive model first receives the input of external information, and then our model accepts it. It's the reverse. We first have a prediction model. And then, we take the external information and force-fit it into that model. Consciousness is not an outside-in signal flow. It's an inside-out signal flow. The world is brain-filled, constructed, by us. Actually, this idea was proposed back in the 18th century by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that our knowledge of the world isn't our cognitive system conforming to the external objects. It's the reverse. It's the external objects that must conform to our forms of cognition. That's how knowledge happens. This is the famous Copernican revolution in epistemology. By the same token, according to predictive processing theory, our mind is not passively recording an objective, external reality. It's the reverse. Our cognitive model is actively constructing and predicting the so-called external reality. For example, you're walking in the park. Hey, at that moment, you see a white, fluffy thing up ahead. You immediately predict, that's a cat. It's not that you observed it for a long time, looking left, looking right, walking around behind it, and then, oh, it has a cat's eyes, and a cat's 4 legs. Therefore, I judge, that is a cat. No. It's that, from the very beginning, you first had the prediction model of a cat. You had the label cat. And then, the incoming visual and auditory information, slap. Very fast, you immediately stuck that label on it. Oh, I am conscious of a cat. As for what the cognitive object cat itself is, that's not important. You have to understand, the signals transmitted to us from the outside world, that's all just chaos. It's all, what? Wavelengths, atoms, molecules, photons. There is no cat, no white, no red label out there. All of these labels are the prediction models that we brain-filled, constructed. So, what is the world in itself, separate from our brain-filling? That is something we can never know. In Kant's words, the world in itself is the thing in itself. The thing in itself is unknowable. All we can know are the illusions. So, someone has to ask, well, if our consciousness is just an illusion, doesn't that mean we're living in the Truman Show, or in the Matrix? That's horrible. To this worry, predictive processing theory would say, yes, consciousness is an illusion, but it's a useful illusion. What's it useful for? It's beneficial to our survival and reproduction. This illusion of consciousness, in an evolutionary sense, is adaptive. This illusion helps us to actively predict the external environment and act appropriately. This, in turn, helps us find food, avoid predators, and seek mates. For example, I don't know what a red-hot piece of iron is, in itself. But I can predict that it is very hot. Therefore, I should not touch it. Hey, I see a lion. I can predict that it will bite people. Therefore, I run away. I see a beautiful member of the opposite sex. I can predict that being with them will be very happy. Therefore, I begin pursuit. Evolution, it does not require us to care about what the world in itself is. Evolution only requires that we can reproduce. In this evolution, it settles for good enough. Natural selection is not trying to turn every one of us into a scientist or a philosopher, making us deeply understand the phenomena and essence of the world. Natural selection has no such requirement. You have to realize that energy consumption of the human brain is extremely high. The brain's mass is only 2% of the body's total mass, but its energy consumption is 20% of the body's total energy. Our brains already consume this much energy. Anymore, and it's not worth it. You know, doing math problems, doing logical deduction, that burns the brain. Isn't it tiring? Right? Isn't there that joke? 3 scholars are on a train, visiting Scotland for the first time. They look out the train window and see a black sheep. The humanities scholar says, "Wow! The sheep in Scotland are all black." The scientist says, "Wrong. You can only say that in Scotland, there is one sheep that is black." The logician says, "Wrong. You can only say that in Scotland, there exists one sheep, and the side of it facing the train is black." Of course, this joke is supposed to be about how rigorous the logician's thinking is. But, according to predictive processing theory, the operating mode of our cognitive system is precisely not like that logician's, sitting there all day doing logical deduction, using that high-energy mode. It is like the humanities scholar or the scientist. Just roughly toss out a conclusion, and that's good enough. Evolution doesn't require us to analyze every specific problem in detail. Instead, evolution built us prediction models as shortcuts. So, we can understand these prediction models, these shortcuts, as cognitive routines. A routine is, don't use your brain, just follow the procedure. Use your intuition, make a direct judgment. Directly force-fit the external information into our cognitive routine. So, someone else asks, well, if we're always just not thinking, just using these routines to force-fit everything, what if it doesn't fit? What if our intuition is wrong? Wouldn't these shortcuts be bad for our survival and reproduction? It's not like that. Even though the prediction model is a routine, this routine can be adjusted and iterated. Its process of iteration is a Bayesian inference process. What is Bayesian inference? Simply put, it's based on new information received, constantly revising and adjusting our existing beliefs. And the beliefs here are our existing prediction models. This new information received especially refers to error information. That is, places where the information does not match our existing prediction model. We find a mismatch. Hey, for example, our prediction model at the beginning defaults to the left side and the right side of a sheep are, with high probability, the same color. Hey, so, we're just like that humanities scholar or scientist. We see half the sheep is black, so we automatically brainfill that its whole body is black. But, if one day, the sheep genetically mutate, and a whole bunch of half-black, half-white sheep appear. Because we've hit the wall so many times, then our prediction model will iterate. Anyway, the core spirit is, you must first have an a priori prediction model. Then, based on the new information you gather, you adjust and iterate your prediction model. Eventually, this makes your prediction model, your cognitive routine, and the external input information match perfectly. To use the jargon, this Bayesian process, its goal is free energy minimization. That is, to reduce the system's uncertainty in the brain. To minimize the prediction error of our prediction model. It's about training your routine so it perfectly matches the external information. This is just like neural network machine learning now. Right? At the beginning, we just give the neural network some randomly set weight parameters. And then, we slowly train it, adjusting and modifying the weight parameters. And then, you input a random picture of, say, a cat, and the machine can immediately recognize it. Our human prediction models are also constantly being revised and adjusted through life experience. So, someone asks again, machine learning parameters are randomly set at the beginning. But what about us, humans? When we roll out, do we have factory settings that aren't random? Some people do come with factory settings. Of course, this is from evolution. And through heredity, hey, we don't need postnatal learning to already possess innate knowledge. This is well documented. Scientists studying newborn infants, they find that infants already possess some innate knowledge that wasn't learned. For example, fear of heights, hey. Fear of snakes, and also some so-called naive physics knowledge. Hey, for example, an object occupies a certain space. And it only occupies one space at a time, it won't appear in 2 places at once, it also won't suddenly disappear, etc. This innate knowledge is all pre-installed in our minds through heredity. So, someone else asks, this predictive processing theory, How does it explain the sense of self in human consciousness? That first-person, subjective self-awareness? According to predictive processing theory, how is self-awareness generated? It's that we, at every single moment, are automatically brain-filling, predicting, the environmental information and our actions. And, we are at every single moment, receiving feedback from the external information. This forms a constantly ongoing predict-feedback-feedback-predict loop. This loop keeps on turning. And so, we generate a continuous sense of control over ourselves. This sense of control is the source of self-awareness. Furthermore, on the interpersonal and social level, it's the same logic. Who am I? Also depends on my own subjective prediction model. That is, the story I tell myself. This is my prediction model of myself. Hey, for example, the story I tell myself is, I am a super handsome guy. I believe this self-narrative. In the future, when I interact with people, hey, I'll take this self-narrative and use it to interact with them. Hey, I will, relying on my good looks, be proactive, actively asking everyone to like, subscribe, and share. But, this prediction model, it also has to undergo Bayesian feedback adjustment, right? Hey, for example, I think I'm a handsome guy, but when I interact with people, the feedback I get doesn't really support my story. I say like and subscribe, people always say next time for sure. I hit a wall, right? I get called a man with no self-awareness. People don't like me. If I get this feedback multiple times, I will modify my prediction model of myself. So, either I start telling myself, I'm actually not that good looking. Or, I tell myself, I actually have a kind of beauty that is difficult for others to perceive. In any case, I must adjust this prediction model. Okay, that is the predictive processing theory's explanation for the generation of self-awareness. It's this prediction and feedback mechanism, this code, this narrative, this illusion, continuously proceeding, looping over and over, this forms your consciousness. Actually, this predictive processing theory also has some implications for our lives. First, people can learn. We might all have different factory settings. For example, everyone's innate IQ might be different. Or, unfortunate childhood experiences might affect a person's personality. But, we can learn, right? Our existing prediction models are not unchangeable. We can change our existing prediction models through learning. The second implication, since our perception of the world is a controlled illusion, is something we subjectively construct, then, in a sense, we can change our lives. Or at least, change our experience of life, by changing our prediction models. Right? The ancient Roman school of philosophy, Stoicism, didn't it teach us? We cannot necessarily change the world itself, but we can change our perspective on the world. This isn't about promoting self-deception. It's about letting go a little in life. Sometimes, when you are held hostage by negative emotions, it's not that the world itself has wronged you, it's that you are making it hard on yourself. Okay. That is the predictive processing theory's explanation of consciousness. So, in terms of machine consciousness engineering, how do we create artificial consciousness? Well, it's about adding this feedback-predict iterative adjustment algorithm into machine learning. The ultimate goal is to continuously reduce the prediction model's prediction error. For example, Alexander Araby at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and Daniel Kiefer at Pennsylvania State University, in a 2022 paper, based on predictive coding theory, proposed a machine learning algorithm that is closer to the human brain's learning mechanism, called neurogenerative coding, NGC. We all know, traditional neural network deep learning algorithms are based on error backpropagation algorithms, to train, to adjust the connection weights between neurons. But, this error backpropagation algorithm is actually not how our brains operate. And, the weight adjustments made by backpropagation must rely on a global error signal to adjust. It doesn't make local adjustments. In this NGC, neurons learn and adjust using local error signals. This local neuron predicts the state of another local neuron, and based on the difference between the prediction and the observed signal, it adjusts the local model's parameters. The experimental results show that the NGC architecture is far more flexible and efficient than the traditional neural network deep learning architecture. Okay, after introducing predictive processing theory, what about the criticisms of this theory? One of the main ones is the criticism of the free energy minimization principle I mentioned earlier, also known as the darkroom problem. This is, if the free energy minimization principle just means pursuing the elimination of prediction error, pursuing a perfect match between our routines and external information, then a problem arises. If eliminating prediction error is the goal, then we would eventually evolve into a state with no accidents, no surprises. Sort of like being in a completely dark room. We would never encounter any new information. Right? No input, no error. Lying flat, doing nothing, is never wrong. But this situation does not match our actual behavior. Because we usually create uncertainty for ourselves. We seek new experiences. And changes in the environment inevitably create new experiences. We don't just stay in a completely predictable environment. Okay, that is predictive processing theory. Consciousness arises from our prediction model's subjective construction of external information. So-called phenomenal consciousness is actually an illusion. Do you think this theory successfully defeats Chalmers' challenge? And can it effectively guide us in creating artificial consciousness? Alright, after predictive processing theory, we will next introduce quantum consciousness theory. We said before, the theories of consciousness we're introducing today are generally all in the physicalist camp. That is, they advocate that matter determines consciousness, and consciousness is derived from matter. This physicalism, in today's context, can also be called physicalism. That is, conscious phenomena are, at their root, physical phenomena. Now, this quantum consciousness theory we're about to introduce, it counts as physicalism, I guess. But quantum consciousness theory believes that all the previous physicalisms are wrong. Why? Because the previous physicalisms are all built on the foundation of classical physics. And classical physics cannot explain the origin of consciousness. The mechanism of consciousness is a quantum mechanical mechanism. This quantum consciousness theory is a theory that is very famous, but also very controversial in academia. Because quantum mechanics itself is a rather mystical subject. As the saying goes, when in doubt, quantum mechanics. Even Einstein would be confused. The explanation of quantum mechanics is very hard to explain clearly. The mainstream explanation is the Copenhagen interpretation, proposed by the Copenhagen school of physicists, like Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. And this so-called Copenhagen interpretation is basically the Copenhagen non-explanation. The motto of this school is, shut up and calculate. That is, don't bother with the physical meaning or philosophical meaning of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics does not reflect the essence of the world. You just sit there and coldly and emotionlessly do the math. Just sit there and solve the Schrödinger equation for me. That's it. Other than that, quantum mechanics has no meaning. Even what does quantum mechanics itself mean? It doesn't mean anything. You're taking quantum mechanics, this thing that is already mystical, to explain consciousness, this thing that is even more mystical. This is mysticism plus mysticism. This is next-level mysticism 2.0. One of the representative figures of using quantum mechanics to explain consciousness is the famous British physicist, the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics laureate, Roger Penrose. Penrose believes that the mechanism of consciousness generation is a quantum mechanical mechanism. Hey, how does explaining consciousness get tangled up with quantum mechanics? To talk about this, we have to first popularize quantum mechanics. We all know, according to classical mechanics, a physical particle, whether a photon or an electron, it should be like a little ball. Just like a macroscopic object. It should obey the principles of mechanics. It occupies a certain space, and then it bounces around in space. This creates motion of matter. But quantum mechanics tells us, in the microscopic world, it's not like that. Right? We learned in middle school, in the microscopic world, this physical particle has something called wave-particle duality. That is, on the micro level, this particle, which should be like a little ball, also has a wave-like nature. It presents as a wave-like cloud state. This is the so-called quantum superposition. We all know the famous double-slit experiment. There are left and right two slits that a particle can pass through. According to the logic of the macroscopic world, this particle either goes through the left path, or it goes through the right path. It acts like a little ball particle state. But the experiment found that this particle both went through the left path and went through the right path. It interfered with itself. That is, two paths, one particle, traveled both at the same time. This is very strange. Now, you might say, that's not weird. You just said, on the micro level, particles have wave-like nature. A wave can go through both paths, right? Not weird. It's not that simple. The experiment found. When you are not observing this particle, it is both left and right, in a superposition state. But, the strange part is, the instant you observe it, this wave instantly collapses. It goes from a superposition state of both left and right, and instantly collapses into a definite state of either left or right. And whether it collapses into left or right, is random. This is the true randomness phenomenon in quantum mechanics. This collapse from superposition to definite state, in the Schrödinger equation, is represented as the collapse of the wave function. The problem is, why does the wave function collapse? A wave in a superposition state of both left and right, how does it, because of a human observation, inexplicably collapse into a definite particle? Of course, according to the Copenhagen non-explanation lie-flat strategy, it's don't ask. If you ask, when in doubt, quantum mechanics. You just sit there and do the math. In the Schrödinger equation, the collapse of the wave function is non-deterministic. It solves for a probability value. Did you hear that? Probability? This made many physicists feel deeply ashamed. Including Einstein, he couldn't stand it. This is. Hey! We physicists study deterministic science. A is A, B is B. Hey! We do the math, we must get a definite mathematical solution. You're over there, solving for a probability? You've turned physics into sociology, haven't you? So, faced with the Copenhagen non-explanation, many physicists tried to explain the wave function collapse. Among them, the most famous thought experiment is Schrödinger's cat. The physicist Schrödinger, who proposed the Schrödinger equation, tried to explain what superposition collapse was really like. He imagined, we put a cat and a quantum device into a box. This quantum device is a radioactive atom and a vial of poison. We know whether a radioactive atom decays is a quantum random event. If the atom in the box decays, hey, it will trigger a mechanism, and the poison vial will be broken, and the poison will kill the cat. If the atom does not decay, then it won't trigger the mechanism, and the cat will live. As we said, whether the radioactive atom decays is a quantum random event. Therefore, this radioactive atom is in a quantum superposition state, of both decaying and not decaying. So, linked to this cat is also in a quantum superposition state. Before we open the box and observe the cat, this cat is in a state of both dead and alive. Note! It's both dead and alive, not either dead or alive. Unless, we open the box and observe the cat. Hey, the cat will then collapse into a state of either dead or alive. So, the question is, before we open the box and observe, how can this cat possibly be in a state of both dead and alive? Of course, when Schrödinger first proposed this thought experiment, it was to refute the Copenhagen interpretation. Because the Copenhagen non-explanation holds that before the wave function collapse, the particle is in a both this and that superposition. Superposition is superposition, don't ask why, it just is. Schrödinger did this thought experiment to mock the Copenhagen interpretation, so what is a both this and that superposition? It's absurd. It's as absurd as this both dead and alive cat in this box. But, later, another physicist, Eugene Wigner, built upon Schrödinger's cat, and did another thought experiment. This time, he wasn't just mocking the Copenhagen non-explanation. He was using this thought experiment to positively explain the collapse of superposition. This thought experiment is Wigner's friend. As we said, the cat in the box is in a both dead and alive superposition. Wigner's scenario is, in the box with the poison, also add Wigner's physicist colleague friend. Of course, not like the cat, the friend won't be poisoned. Wigner's friend is in the box wearing a gas mask, observing the cat. So, what effect does this observation have? We said before, in the double-slit experiment, before the experimenter observes, the particle is both left and right. But once the experimenter uses an instrument to observe, the particle instantly collapses into either left or right. The question is, why does human observation cause a particle in superposition to collapse into a definite state? What role does human observation play in quantum mechanics? Okay, let's go back to the friend in the box. Because he is in the box, he can observe the cat's life or death status. So, his observation will cause the cat to go from both dead and alive, and collapse into a definite either dead or alive. Of course, whether it collapses into dead or alive is truly random. At this time, let's imagine. Outside the box stands Wigner himself. Since Wigner cannot observe the situation inside the box, even if his friend inside the box has already observed the cat collapse into a definite either dead or alive state. But Wigner, outside the box, does not know what result his friend observed. To Wigner, this cat, along with the friend inside the box, are all in a quantum superposition state. Okay, now let's imagine this situation. The friend in the box observes the cat randomly collapse into a dead state. But Wigner, outside the box, did not observe this. It is entirely possible that Wigner, when he opens the box and observes the inside, he finds the cat collapsed into an alive state. Because the entire box, to Wigner, is in quantum superposition. What it collapses into is completely random. It's entirely possible that the cat collapses into an alive state. So, this thought experiment creates a paradox. And the key to resolving this paradox is, for the same physical event, the result observed by the friend and the result observed by Wigner can be completely different. This thought experiment further reveals, philosophically, does objective reality truly exist? It doesn't. Different people, for the same physical phenomenon, can observe completely different results. And don't think this is just a thought experiment. Later physicists confirmed Wigner's idea with physical experiments. Objective reality does not exist. The result of the observation depends on the observer's subjective perspective. The collapse of the wave function might be a subjective thing. Wigner's idea tells us that in the mechanism of quantum mechanics, there is something subjective involved. We said before, due to human observation, the superposition wave function collapses into a definite state. Why does human observation make the wave function collapse? Very possibly, because of human consciousness. After popularizing quantum mechanics for so long, we finally get back to quantum consciousness. Actually, it's not just Wigner who thought human consciousness was involved in quantum mechanics. The multidisciplinary brain John von Neumann also believed it is human consciousness that collapses the wave function. Matter determines consciousness, matter can change our consciousness. But, at the same time, our consciousness can, in reverse, change matter. Whether the cat in the box is dead or alive, is determined by the subjective consciousness of us, the observers. So, this quantum mechanical wave function collapse has subjectivity. Now think, what else in this world also has subjectivity? That would be human consciousness. Right? We said before, an important aspect of human consciousness is phenomenal consciousness. It's the subjective feeling that consciousness gives us, that cannot be clearly described by third-person language or scientific description. So how do we explain this subjective feeling? We've just been talking. Quantum mechanics also has this subjectivity. So, could it be that the generation mechanism of human consciousness is a quantum mechanical mechanism? Okay, now we can go back to Penrose. Penrose believes that inside our brain's nerve cells, in the cytoplasm, there is this especially tiny structure. Penrose calls it a microtubule. These microtubules, because they are small enough, they allow the quantum superposition of the microscopic world to exist inside them. This means that the transmission process of neural signals in our brain is based on a more fundamental quantum process. So, changes in thought in our brain are because the superposition in the microtubules collapsed, randomly collapsed into a definite state. And this, in turn, cause the transmission of the neural electrical signal. This is the fundamental mechanism of consciousness generation. We all know, if our consciousness generation mechanism is based on the quantum mechanical wave function collapse mechanism. This doesn't just explain the hard problem of consciousness, it also explains free will, that great philosophical problem. If quantum consciousness theory is correct, then humans do have free will. A person's thoughts, intentions, choices, are not determined by classical mechanics' mechanical determinism. They are truly random. We can go left, and we can go right. We can order KFC, and we can order McDonald's. Before the wave function collapses in the microtubules, our choice is undetermined. This reserves space for human free will. Okay. Quantum consciousness theory, we'll explain it up to here. Next, how do we apply this quantum consciousness theory to the engineering of machine consciousness? Simple, right? Quantum computers. Penrose believes that the human brain is not a classical architecture computer, because this wave function collapse is truly random. This stuff classical computers cannot calculate. But don't we have quantum computers now? The true randomness of wave function collapse that classical computers cannot achieve, quantum computers can achieve. So, if you want to simulate the human brain's consciousness, you must use a quantum computer. And the principle of this quantum computer is using the true randomness of quantum mechanical wave function collapse to replace the deterministic computation, either 0 or 1, of classical computers. Of course, the specific mechanism of quantum computers, and what stage of development they're at, that's another big topic. Limited space, we won't say more here. In short, quantum consciousness theory tells us the generation mechanism of human consciousness is a quantum mechanical mechanism. This subjectivity of human consciousness, where does it come from? It comes from quantum mechanics. Because the collapse of the wave function, in the view of Wigner and von Neumann, also has subjectivity. Of course, the drawback of quantum consciousness theory is what we said at the beginning of this section, it's a bit mystical. Right? Quantum mechanics, this mysticism, plus the problem of consciousness, this mysticism. Mysticism upon mysticism. Mysticism 2.0. Of course, compared to the previous theories of consciousness. The previous theories were all at the macro level, trying to build some model to explain consciousness. This quantum consciousness theory is attempting to break through the difficulty of consciousness from the most hardcore, most fundamental level. Although there are many parts of this theory that cannot be clearly explained, many are still just hypotheses. We welcome you to participate in this research. If one day you can figure it out, then the Nobel Prize is definitely yours. And the history of philosophy will record your name. You will be the one who ended the philosophy of mind. Okay, after introducing quantum consciousness theory. Next, we enter the concluding summary of this How to Make AI Conscious symposium. In this episode, we shared 5 mainstream theoretical models for explaining consciousness, and using them as a guide to try to create conscious AI. Let's briefly summarize these 5 theoretical models. Higher order representation theory believes consciousness arises from the higher order re-representation of first order representations. When we perceive that we are perceiving, consciousness emerges. Global workspace theory believes consciousness arises from local cognitive modules being globally broadcast. If a mental state is locally distributed, it is unconscious. If it is globally distributed, it is conscious. Integrated information theory believes consciousness arises from a cognitive system, as a whole, integrating a vast amount of information. A system with a high degree of information integration can produce consciousness. Predictive processing theory believes consciousness arises from our prediction model's subjective construction of external information. Consciousness itself is actually an illusion. Quantum consciousness theory believes the observation by a conscious human causes the wave function in quantum mechanics to collapse. And human consciousness also arises from the wave function collapse effect in tiny structures in the brain. The 5 models for explaining consciousness introduced in this episode, which one do you think is more scientific, more reasonable? Do you think their explanation of consciousness, starting from a physicalist perspective, successfully defeats Chalmers' challenge? And can effectively guide us in creating artificial consciousness? Right now, AI research is very hot in every field. Whether in philosophy, psychology, brain science, cognitive science, AI research is very hot. Actually, when we research artificial intelligence, we are also researching ourselves as humans. Doesn't everyone say it now? This era is a very strange era. Machines are becoming more and more like humans. And humans are becoming more and more like machines. With the development of artificial intelligence, machines become more intelligent, more like humans. And with the development of biology, brain science, cognitive science, the more we understand humans, the more we feel that we ourselves are more and more like a machine. Actually, these two aspects are not separate. We research human consciousness, wanting to explain the generation mechanism of consciousness, also for the purpose of creating machines that are as smart as us humans. And of course, the reverse is true too. We research artificial intelligence, also for the purpose of researching ourselves. We want to use the research of intelligent, or even conscious, machines, to research what we humans are. So, what do you think? These 5 mainstream physicalist camp models for explaining consciousness introduced today, have they successfully defended the completeness of physicalism? We welcome you to join the philosophers and participate in a discussion of this big question. Their opinions have been stated. Now, it's your turn to speak. Please, cast your vote in the comments section below, and state your views. Good night and thank you for your patience, my dear friends.